Several colleagues who took part in one of my training years back suggested that I do an episode on the method that most directly works to generate culturally mature understanding. I call it simply parts work. All I can do here is a briefest of introductions, but that will serve to help further fill out what makes culturally mature perspective significant and different from how we have understood in times past. Talking about cultural mature perspective in terms of holding the whole box of crayons of our systemic complexity, as I did in the previous episode, can help us begin to grasp where culturally mature understanding takes us. But parts work specifically gets us there. I describe the approach in depth and provide numerous examples in my comprehensive book, Creative Systems Theory. In doing parts work, the person envisions various aspects of themselves, or perhaps aspects of a question that concerns them, like characters in a play, leading from his or her whole person, whole system, culturally mature perspective chair. The person engages the various parts set in chairs around the room in conversation, moving back and forth between the whole person chair and the various parts. My job is to facilitate those conversations. If parts work is done well, the technique gives almost no choice but to bring the needed more mature and systemic understanding to bear. Parts work can also be done with more than one person as a way to address larger cultural issues. In doing parts work, one follows three cardinal rules. Together, these rules get at where integrative meta-perspective takes us in a way that is quite precise. Each rule informs a particular aspect of culturally mature understanding. The first rule, the whole person chair or whole system perspective chair with larger cultural issues, provides the leadership in a culturally mature reality. It is a whole person chair that interacts with the world, and the whole person chair, through interacting with each of the parts, draws on their contributions. This rule makes parts work a hands-on exercise for practicing culturally mature leadership in oneself and in the world. The second rule follows from the first. Parts don't interact with the world. A person doing parts work quickly recognizes that engage in the world through parts, while it is what most people do the larger portion of the time, produces limited and limiting results. People also come to recognize that ideological beliefs, whether political, religious, or those of competing belief systems within their particular professions, involve parts taking over and acting as if they have a relationship with the world. The third cardinal rule is that parts don't talk to other parts. This recognition can take a bit longer to grasp, but it is ultimately just as significant. We can think of much in the internal struggles of daily life as crosstalk between competing parts. And the implications are just as significant more collectively. Parts talking to parts can have us confuse moderation or compromise with culturally mature perspective. In addition, ideological beliefs of the less extreme sort often have their roots in parts talking to parts. Creative systems theory describes how we can understand the back and forth between competing worldviews over the course of history as a similar kind of conversation between systemic parts. The results when follow these cardinal rules is a kind of cognitive rewiring. Wires are cut between parts, and between parts in the world, and between parts. At the same time, people strengthen the wires that run between themselves and the world, and also between themselves and the diverse and various creative and contributing parts. Key to the power of parts work approach is that the person does not need to be conscious of why this is working. Get the wiring right, and culturally mature understanding and culturally mature leadership capacities are natural results. As a therapist, I use parts work to help people address internal conflicts and find more complete ways of being in the world. In training leaders, I use it to address conflicting societal beliefs and to help people grasp how ideological conclusions that might seem incompatible reflect aspects of a needed larger systemic picture. In my most recent book, Perspective and Guidance for a Time of Deep Discord, I apply Part's work to an array of issues that today tend to become immediately polarized: climate change, healthcare reform, race and gender, abortion, immigration, and more. Part's work could also be used to engage overarching questions more systemically. For example, in my book, Creative Systems Theory, I describe how it can reconcile the most ultimate and timeless of polarities, that which divides the material and the spiritual, science and religion. The way that Part's work, when done well, challenges the assumptions equally of someone who identifies more with scientific or religious conclusions, further highlights how culturally mature perspective is new in a fundamental sense. It also provides good illustration of the power of Part's work. Someone of more scientific bent doing Part's work is likely, at least initially, to assume that a part that thinks rationally and scientifically appropriately sits in the whole person, whole system chair. This is not an unreasonable assumption, given where the person has most often found significance. But it is not too long before it becomes clear to the person that many concerns, and concerns of no small importance, particularly in one's personal life, such as purpose or love, that this part is limited in what it has to contribute. Eventually, the person comes to recognize how more than just this part is needed, not just to make good personal life choices, but also for the most filled out and creative kind of science. Something very similar tends to happen for people who identify with more spiritual inclinations. This may be an individual with quite traditional religious beliefs, a person with more humanistic, spiritual, but not religious tendencies, or someone of more New Age bent. Commonly, the person will assume that spiritual truth appropriately sits in the whole person, whole system chair. And again, for them, this is not an unreasonable conclusion. But if the person of more spiritual religious inclination works long enough, they recognize in a similar way that having spiritual truth sit in the whole person, whole system chair in our time leads to problems. An all too common result is poorly thought out life choices and unsuccessful relationships. It turns out that in a well-lived life, a spiritual life in the best sense, the more manifest parts of existence are as important as the essences. Eventually, the person may realize that holding the spiritual more systemically in this way will be key not just to making good everyday choices, but to the most full and creative relationship to spiritual experience. In doing Part's work, the chairs that advocate for aspects of larger truths, whether personal truths or truths of a more social or even philosophical sort, each in important ways add to the whole person, whole system perspective chair's reflections. But they function at best as consultants. When we miss this fact, ultimately unhelpful, indeed dangerous, specifically ideological conclusions result. With Part's work, people confront this recognition not just as some abstract conclusion, but personally and immediately. Living from the whole person chair is the ultimate task with culturally mature leadership, whether in our personal lives or more broadly. We can think of doing so as what ultimately defines today's needed new common sense. As always, I encourage thoughts and questions, and you can subscribe if you like to the weekly episodes sent to you in your inbox.